Okay, you're good.
Welcome, everybody. Glad you could make the call. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tim Perone. I'm the president of Town Square Interactive and Town Square Ignite. I'm really excited to be able to kick this call off and thrilled to be part of our second conversation with Dr. Lyndon Abrams. He's going to help us celebrate Black History Month today. And for those of you that didn't make the first call, Dr. Abrams allowed me, to bring him on the call so that he could answer our questions, but I'd definitely like to introduce him. Dr. Abrams is an associate professor in the Department of Counseling at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He coordinated the department's doctoral program and teaches courses in the areas of counseling theory and multicultural counseling. He is a past recipient of the university's Bonnie E. Cone Distinguished Professorship for Teaching. He also received the College of Education's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Dr. Abrams' interests include racial identity development, social desirability responding, efforts to increase the participation of underrepresented groups in STEM career fields, and efforts to reduce violence among young people. Formerly, Dr. Abrams served as a counselor working with college students and with emotionally and behaviorally challenged adolescents. Dr. Abrams, second time, welcome.
Happy to be here with you.
That's great. So what we're going to do today is we solicit our employee base, and we really wanted to get some questions that we could ask you that would be relevant to celebrating Black History Month. Good for us is we had unbelievable participation and had a ton of questions that were received, but our Diversity Council worked to peel through the questions and really pick the ones that were most relevant towards celebrating Black History Month. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you some of those questions and hear your thoughts.
Great. The challenge is I'm not a historian, but I'm acquainted with much of the history, so happy to participate.
Okay, that sounds good. So why don't we just get it started? So why is it important to know African American history and to celebrate Black History Month in your view?
Wow, that's a big question and loaded, but I would point up maybe two or three points that I think are important. The first is that the history of any one American is the history of all of America. And so African American or Black history is a history shared by all of us. And allowing ourselves, being better informed, allows us to build on rather than run from or repeat our history. So knowing where we've been helps us to know where we want to go and where we ought to be going. The third thing I would say is, and this is, I think, a little bit more complex a notion. We need to see representations of ourselves in the world. All of us do as citizens. The more we are allowed to see ourselves in the world, and that is every individual, the more actively we can participate in shaping what goes on around us, the more invested we are in the world that we live in. The more we can see ourselves in the world, the greater we are nationally and as a cohesive bond. And let me just illustrate that notion by telling you a little brief story about me, and I'm telling on myself, and it's something that I think most people in my ilk would be embarrassed by, but I think it illustrates the point. When I was a little kid, I would hear Chuck Berry records, and I would think, there's no way a Black man wrote those songs. Because the images that I'd received of myself didn't allow me to see African American folk in any position of prominence. Now, I started school in the first years of desegregated schools in Sumter County, South Carolina. And that was an interesting time. And there was not a whole lot of effort made to create a space where I could see myself. Now, I grew up from that. And And I learned not only about Chuck Berry, but about Motown and about all the great music that was produced by people who look like me. But I could have benefited from having that exposure early on. And so history and an appreciation of where we come from is an important element for us at all stages of our development.
So you made a statement there, and you said it's really important for us to see ourselves in the world. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? That's pretty interesting, because that seems like a key component of what you're trying to get across.
Yeah, a roadmap, an example. Um, when I was a young person, I went to a college graduation and I saw all of these folks in this beautifully colored academic regalia. And I saw people who looked like me. And it was at that point that I thought I could maybe be one of those people one day. I could maybe be a teacher in a university setting, maybe, or a professor. Wow, what a novel thought. And that idea was born from seeing those people who looked like me. Um, and so seeing that representation of myself out there in the world, in a world that I could aspire to, was a big deal. And for that same reason, whenever we have a graduation at the university, I'm in attendance with all of my academic regalia on, hoping there's somebody who maybe looks at me and says, "Wow, look at that guy. He looks like me. I could do that too." And so, seeing positive images of yourself being projected, um, that's just such an important part of learning to be enfranchised with the larger group. And another example of that might be, the musical Hamilton really struck a chord across the population. Um, it had me looking at, I went and bought the Hamilton, um, the Chernow biography. Now I don't read biographies on American colonialists. It's just not something that I do. But because Hamilton, the musical, was portrayed using characters that look like me, I was suddenly able to see the relatedness between our American history and me as an individual, something that I didn't care much about when I sat in history class 20, 30 years ago. So those representations are essential.
That's great, and I appreciate you elaborating on that. And I'm a massive fan of Hamilton myself, so I can totally relate. But what are your thoughts on how Black History Month is traditionally taught in school, and mainly elementary school?
Yeah, we got some problems there. Um, we've got some problems with history in general, in terms of what we do with history. We don't always tell the truth. We have a truncated sense of what history looks like. Um, and so what we will do sometimes is, we'll take a character and we will slice and dice and present only certain aspects about that character. And our history and civics education has become more about creating good citizens than it is about helping folks to be critical thinkers. So we won't project the complexities of a Thomas Jefferson or a George Washington. We see the sanitized, polished version of them, and we don't see the complexities that they actually lived with, so that we could really understand the kinds of decisions that they had to make. And so because of that, history for a lot of kids is really a dead subject. It's the the subject often that many folks really don't like much. And again, it goes back to that notion of history being used as an indoctrination tool more than as a subject to inspire civic understanding and civic growth and civic participation. Kids aren't critically evaluating what they're being told. They're being told to memorize facts, and a lot of those facts are lies. To put it bluntly, in fact, a guy named James Llewellyn, Llewellyn, wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, where he just took a number of things that have been erroneously projected to young people, and he expanded and gave context for those things. And it enabled kids to have a more critical dialogue about American history. And not only should that take place about our history at large, it should take place with regard to African American history. We need to tell the broader truth. We need to expand our dialogue and include the context behind many of the things that we want folks to understand.
Yeah, so I mean, as an educator yourself, why do you think the national education system, specifically as it relates to elementary schooling, why do you think they take that approach towards history? And why? What would it take to change that?
I think there are a number of factors. We want folks to have a sanitized view of America, but America is not really a sanitized place. We got issues that will maintaining the status quo around these issues. It's desirable for some people, but certainly not for all. So there's an effort, I think, to sort of, let's not dig in that's like garbage. Don't dig in it, just let it sit. But you still got garbage there, and that doesn't. It doesn't rid itself. Eventually, something's going to happen. You're going to have guests. They're going to come and see the garbage, and you're going to have to deal with it. And so my notion is that we expose young people to critical dialogue, and they're smart. They'll understand their two sides. They do it with math. They do it with biology. They do it with the other subjects. Let's give history its due, and let's free history teachers to be critical thinkers and supporters of critical dialogue rather than the folks who force kids to memorize facts.
So yeah, you answered my next question here, is there anything you would change? And you clearly hit on that. But what do you think it would take to change?
Well, a groundswell, and I think the events of the recent year really have pointed to the need for us to address how we see ourselves and how we see others. All of the events of the last few months have prompted, I think, a lot of critical thinking and dialogue. And people are listening now more than I think they have historically about, or listening to one another, when perhaps they didn't think that was necessary months ago.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you that there's a lot more listening happening. I do definitely think there needs to be more and more listening that needs to be happening. But, as it relates to specific figures you'd like to see highlighted during Black History Month, are there typically those that aren't that you would like to have seen highlighted?
We have a history of sort of having our sort of our favorites, the folks that aren't too controversial, that don't inspire too much rah-rah. We love MLK, but we forget that he was public enemy number one in 1966, 67, and 68 prior to his death. we didn't embrace him until after he was gone, until until we could see him as a non-threatening sort of figure. We'll embrace a Harriet Tubman because that's a nice feel-good story. But there are a lot of other folks who are a little bit more radical in their approach to emancipation that we won't embrace. We'll embrace, for example, a Frederick Douglass, but we won't tell the whole story. And that's, we're missing the complexity there. We're missing the truth, the whole truth. There's some individuals that we're afraid of, we shy away from. People like Malcolm X, he's often described as this sort of really radical, we'll use violence to destroy you if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And maybe a bit of that is true, but he was certainly much more complex than, quote, this radical, violence-loving individual that he's often portrayed as. And he was dynamic in his evolution to be embracing of all folks who could be supportive of establishing equity for all. And he doesn't get credit for his growth because people focus just on the images that have been portrayed about him as being really this really radical guy. There are people like Robert Smalls of South Carolina. And if you're a Civil War buff, you know who Robert Smalls is. But he was a person who was enslaved, who commandeered a Confederate transport ship, and he got away with the entire boat and sailed it into Union waters and delivered that material to those folks. And it was seeing him do what he did militarily, even from his background, that prompted Lincoln to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we can use African American folks in the military. Look at this incredible example. We don't recognize many of those people. I mean, we recognize a Thurgood Marshall, but we don't recognize a Charles Houston. Charles Houston was Thurgood Marshall's teacher at Howard University Law School. And if you don't have Charles Houston, you don't get Thurgood Marshall. And in fact, Charles Houston preceded Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And it was his work that came before Brown versus Board of Education that set in place Thurgood Marshall's important case of Brown versus Board of Education. So there are a lot of people we don't get to see. Some of them we don't get to see because we maybe see them as being radical, but we need to look at the whole truth. We need to look at both sides of an issue. We need to seek balance, and we need to trust kids, young people, to be able to critically look at and evaluate the history and the whole history.
I appreciate the response there. It's very interesting to hear your take on that. This is one of the most one of the questions that I was most excited to ask you because I'm just generally intrigued. But what are some of the significant Black history moments that you've witnessed in your lifetime? Wow.
Okay, so I was born in 1964, and so there was a lot of interesting stuff that happened prior to my birth that are significant. But if I just think about events that occurred in the course of my life, I've noted a few things that I think are pretty important. In 1964, in July, the Civil Rights Act was signed, right? And I was born in 1964, as I said. Can you guess why my name is Lyndon? Um, and why my family, my aunt in particular, decided I ought to be named Lyndon, and it was in response, or it was the result of the appreciation that my family had for Johnson's, Lyndon Johnson's, embracing of the civil rights legislation. In '65, Malcolm X was assassinated. That's an important historical notion. 65 also was Bloody Summer in Selma. And that was an important issue and an important historical marker, because Bloody Sunday and the events around Bloody Sunday in Selma really allowed America to see the worst of itself. And that was a very deliberate process. King and others basically showed America itself, and the less desirable parts of itself, and it projected it across America, and a consciousness had to be raised around some of that behavior. And so Bloody Sunday, important. The Voting Rights Act of '65, again, tearing down the history of disenfranchisement of certain populations of people of color. This notion of how do we include those folks in such a way as to allow them to be enfranchised. Now, that folks weren't happy about it then, and folks aren't happy about it now. And I think we'll see efforts moving forward to limit people's access to the polls and to the vote, and that's an unfortunate notion. In '67, Thurgood Marshall went to the Supreme Court. Was appointed to the Supreme Court. That was in August of '67. Also in '67, Loving versus Virginia, the case that sought to strike down discrimination based on race. King was assassinated in April of '68. Arthur Ashe became the #1 tennis player in the world in '68. Shirley Chisholm was elected to Congress in '68 and ran for president in 1972, knowing she wouldn't be successful, but seeking to open the door a little bit. Just seeking to open the door so that the next person wouldn't have to say, I'm the first person to have ever tried. So fast forward to '83, when Guy Bluford flew into space, first African-American astronaut. In '83, Vanessa Williams was crowned Miss America. That was a big deal in my memory. In '92, Mae Jemison flew in space, the first African-American woman to fly in space. In 2001, Colin Powell became the first African-American Secretary of State. In 2003, Oprah became a billionaire. And that was a big deal, but she didn't give me any money, but I'm still working on and working through that. Condoleezza Rice in 2005 became the first Black female Secretary of State. And in 2008, Obama was elected president and took office in 2009. That was an event that I thought I would never see that in my lifetime. I thought there's no way folks are going to go from that. And I'm saying folks are going to go from that. I believe that there was too much racial polarization to allow that to happen. But America surprises me sometimes. But the backlash has also surprised me. So um, I think some of the recent events have prompted me to really think about the fact that there is still much work to do.
I couldn't agree more with you there. You've experienced quite a bit as it pertains to, Black history moments. How do you think they've helped mold you as a person? And do you think that each one of these moments allowed you to catapult yourself to where you are today?
Um, I was not aware of all of those events at the times that they occurred, but indeed those events impacted me. Um, growing up and where I came from, I was born and grew up in Sumter County, South Carolina. And that is the middle of the old South.
Mm-hmm.
But Kingstree is right down the road from Sumter. Oh my gosh, and I'm blanking on the astronaut's name. Ron McNair was from Kingstree, South Carolina, and he was also an African American astronaut. He died in the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle.
Mm-hmm.
Challenger or Columbia? Challenger. Um, we lost both of those, right? But and the notion that somebody who came from Kingstree and went to North Carolina A&T could be as incredible a scientist as he was, and to achieve the level that he did. Yes, those doors and um, those actions of folks in that history that we mentioned all impacted me, opened doors for me, caused people to see me as a potential contributor. And so I didn't directly observe everything that I mentioned, but I was impacted by all of that. And it helps me to take stock and to take inventory of that. Um, Oprah's probably not going to give me any money, right? I'm just and I don't know. Maybe she's watching. Maybe she's at a town square media office watching and takes pity on me. But the fact that I get to see that is possible opens doors in my mind, in my cultural conditioning, to say that it is indeed possible. So yeah, I'm impacted greatly, I think, by all of those events and all of that history. And again, I think that's another reason why it's important that we take a look at where we're coming from, and the history that we're part of.
Kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the top of the call, as in, your statement about how you see yourself in the world, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. To have again a positive representation of self. Now we get lots of representations of ourselves, but not all of them are really that positive. And that's something I think we have to wrestle with. Um, I think it, again, important that we see positive, viable representations of self.
It's great. So, knowing that the theme of Black History Month in 2021 is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity, I'd like to break that down with you a little bit, if I may.
Sure.
How is the Black family typically represented?
Um, I will say better than it used to be. Historically, if let's just take media, okay? What were the representations of African Americans in the media? Well, I immediately go to the old Amos and Andy bits, and I go to dancing, performing, and that's an important part of African American heritage. It's an important part of where we come from. But if we're just being presented as shuffling, jiving kind of characters, that doesn't tell the whole of who we are, and it gives an unreasonable, unreliable image of ourselves to the world and to others who follow us. If those are the images and the only images that young African Americans see, then it's not difficult to understand why they might emulate that. Now, historically, we've been really, really challenged by that. But we're doing better now. You know, we saw, for example, and many of you may remember this in 19, well, I don't know, it was in the 70s, the 1970s. Good Times, a television show, came on, and it was of a story of a poor family living in an urban poor area, but it was an intact family, which was not necessarily usual. And we saw, increasing from that period of time, more positive representations of African Americans and African American families. In the 80s, we saw The Cosby Show, right? Yeah. Which was, I think, a pretty positive representation of African American families. You know, one of the great criticisms of the Cosby Show, people said it was unrealistic, that wasn't typical of African American families. Well, what do you think the meaning behind that was? It doesn't fit the stereotype, and we need to take that down a peg. But we didn't say that about 8 is Enough and Growing Pains and The Waltons and many of the other shows. So I think it's important that we think about and critically think about how all individuals are presented, and that we do a better job of balancing the view that folks get of all populations of people. And Black America is not a monolith. You know, we are in all shapes, sizes, and colors, and they're really, really, you know, not everybody dances, not everybody sings. I mean, I could demonstrate to you that how wrong you are right now, but I'll save you that, and my wife would probably appreciate it too. So to create a situation where we again have diverse, positive views of self, we've done better with that. Look at, though, what we're seeing now more and more. I think we're being challenged with imagery that is kind of one-sided again, much like we saw in the late 60s, early 70s with the exploitation movies and television to a lesser extent. We're seeing similar kinds of portrayals now, and they don't tell the whole story of who we are, and that's unfortunate.
So you mentioned stereotypes, you know, as it relates to how you know, the Black family is typically represented. What stereotypes do you feel need to be broken?
Wow. You know, where do I start? The notion, well, family systems, what the Black family is like. And we have to back up to see the beginning of that. In 1964, Patrick Moynihan, when he was the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Johnson, did what they call the Moynihan Report. And that report what Moynihan was trying to do was to say that just the civil rights legislation was not going to even the playing field. He wanted to say that more needed to be done to create opportunities for all. And he focused in on the Black family. And what he did, though, inadvertently, was to point and to make comparisons between poor Black families and all of white America. And it wasn't an apples to apples comparison. And so it was what we call deficit modeling. It's when I take an example of someone or something, and I start with the premise that you are less than, and I want to get you up to the level where, in this case, the good white families were, but you weren't comparing similar groups of people. And so we say things that spring back to that period of time about Black families, about families not valuing education, about families not being committed to being in families, about families having low educational expectations. And so we need to rethink much of what we assume, about the Black family, and to really avoid projecting this media that's been fed to us, these media portrayals and the stereotypes that exist in the world, and go and look at people and have conversations with people to really get an appreciation for who they really are. And so challenging, I mean, it's, you turn on the news, and I think people write with a sort of a stereotyped construct of the world. And I think that happens in media. I think that happens in movie, film, video. We have a way of wanting to put images into nice, neat boxes. And some of those boxes have been mislabeled, and some of those boxes don't really exist in the real world. I mean, I was watching. There's an incredible director, one of the most successful African American female directors is a woman named Gina Prince Bythewood. She wrote and produced Love and Basketball, Beyond the Light. She wrote the screenplay for The Secret Life of Bees and directed it. And she's a major player. But she did a film called Beyond the Lights, I mentioned. And she had this vision of this cast of African American folk. And there's a sort of hero character in that film. And Hollywood said to her, "Yeah, we like this, but we want you to cast this lead character as a white male, because I think it fits the image. It will definitely sell more." And she basically said, "No." I was able to fall in love with the characters of The Notebook. They were all white. We're not going to change. I'm not going to change this film. Well, what Hollywood was responding to was the stereotypes about who people were, and we have to get out of that.
So it's a lot that has to do with just simply family identity, our identity in general. So my next question to you would be, what are some of the ways that the Black family's identity has been compromised historically?
Well, through the portrayals that we have seen. There's so many factors. I mean, if we think about historical events that have occurred, consider, consider slavery. Consider the impact of having families ripped apart because you're owned by someone else. 400 years of oppression. Consider Jim Crow. Consider vagrancy laws, which were put in place after the Civil War to combat homelessness. Now, mind you, folks were dismissed from plantations, had no place to go, then were summarily rounded up because they were homeless and imprisoned. Then they were leased as workers to the farms and the plantations where they'd work. Now, at this point, those plantation owners didn't have a vested interest in keeping folks alive, so the treatment in those situations was often worse than during slavery. And so this kind of treatment negatively impacted the Black family. But at the same time, I have to say that the resilient nature of the Black family allowed it to persist even through those times. Black families were as much of a family as one could be in the situation that they lived. That is, as much as they were allowed to be, families were cohesive. I think that's just the nature of family. And that flies in the face of the notion that Black fathers don't care about their children, and many of the other myths that we hear and we see around family systems, particularly in the Black community. And I will make this statement because I read it and it just stuck in my head. There's nothing wrong with the Black family that ending racism can't fix. And I have to credit that to a guy named Andre Perry, a writer from New York, and I forget which venue he writes for, but he said there's nothing wrong with the Black family that cannot be fixed by ending racism.
It's very powerful. So you talked about in a couple prior questions about how Black history moments impacted you personally. How do you think the Black family influences America's culture in general?
Wow, we're infectious, but then we all are. Think about turning on television and watching televangelists, and watching their behavior and asking, who are they emulating? Think about who's buying Jay-Z's CDs, or do we still do CDs? Things
mostly streaming.
Yeah. Who's buying that service? And we are impacted by America, and we impact America. And I say we to mean African America. We're certainly impacted by it, but we are also impacting the lives of all the folks who are around us. And you see that in media portrayals. Now, not all of that media is good and positive, but we see the impact of the information exchange, that takes place. So we impact one another.
Just a broad stroke.
We do. And we can talk about examples of that. If you think about, okay, who was, and I think Eminem is one of the greatest rappers, period. But where did he learn his craft, right? Where did he learn? Who did he pal around with? Who supported his development? So there was an exchange taking place. Indeed, he's a tremendous talent, but he also was a learner in that he studied those folks who supported him.
It's interesting that you go the hip hop route there, because we, like you and I talked about last time, we could talk for days on that.
Yeah, we can.
That's great. So, in your view, what are some of the ideals and themes that you feel like the Black family embodies? Curious to your response.
Well, we have an appreciation for spirituality. And I mean church, but I mean spirituality more broadly. One of the most powerful institutions in the African American community has historically been the Black church. That may not be as true now as it was in, say, 1965, but that sort of spiritual embracing is and has been a strong element in our DNA, in our makeup.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I would mention is the resilientness that we've talked about, in terms of families that sought to be families even when they were broken, even when there was an effort to separate, an effort to separate maliciously, and an effort to separate for economic reasons. But still, through that, the family persisted as much as it was able. And I think the third thing that I would mention here is African American folks and African American family systems have a tremendous capacity to forgive. Because when we consider the history that has taken place, the notion of what do you do in response to that? The world hasn't, through all that has occurred, the world was not flipped upside down. Thomas Jefferson said, there's no way these people are going to live peacefully with us being white folks, after all that we did to them. In substance, that's what he said. Not the words exactly, but that's what he said. And his notion was, we're going to probably have to ship these folks off somewhere, because with the history that we have, there's no way they're going to live peacefully with us. But that has not proven to be the case.
And why do you think that, stemming off of what you just said there, why do you think the ability to forgive is so large within the Black family, the Black community? Because that's very interesting to me, and I can totally understand and see your point.
Well, I think if you tie back in the notion of spirituality and religiosity, there's a command to forgive. And if you carry anger and ill will around, that anger and ill will does more damage than the thing that you're containing it in, than the thing you're trying to pour it on. That is, me containing that stuff, me holding that stuff, does more damage to me than me trying to spew it at you. If that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
It does, and I appreciate you going a little bit deeper for me on that. So, in the essence of time, I have one final question for you, and that would be, what are some everyday actionable items that we can do to honor Black History Month far past February?
Well, I'm going to see if I can think of 2 or 3 things that are small enough but big enough. That is doable, but will impact change. I think the first thing is to recognize that we all have a history, and all of our history is valid and worth considering. Now, that statement comes with substatement A here. And that means we have to have the ability to consider the world outside of ourselves. And that is to empathically look into someone else's worldview and try to see the world from their vantage point.
Mm.
And I think we do that by expressing appreciation for folks and getting to hear their story, earnestly looking into their worlds. So if we recognize that all of our shared history and all of our individual history is important, if we look outside of ourselves and we connect with one another, those are little steps, but I think they make a big difference if we're successful at them. Again, not big steps, but practical steps.
It's a very similar theme to our last conversation we had together, wouldn't you think? Just having the open and honest dialogue and getting to know each other on a more personal basis without judgment, right?
Indeed. I keep saying the same things over and over and again. My students tell me that. But yeah, that I think if we could do that earnestly, then we set ourselves, if we can speak without offending and listen without defending, then we open the door for increased, improved dialogue. That sounded good. I can't take credit for that. That's Montel Williams.
I was just going to tell you, you said that exact statement last call that we had, and it stuck with me. And out of the entire conversation, the communication in that statement really resonated with me. So I appreciate you saying it again, because there may be people that weren't able to attend the first call that would get exposed to something that I felt was very powerful.
Thank you.
Dr. Abrams, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I about have run out of things to say.
Is that possible?
Well, my students would say no.
Well, I've definitely enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad I am personally asked to do these things with you, because I think that the content that you put down is definitely worth hearing. And I've enjoyed getting to know you a little bit more. And I appreciate you just taking the time out of your busy schedule and sharing your thoughts with our employees that have attended this call.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and I apologize that I'm not a historian and can't tell you the whole story, but I certainly can tell you from one person's perspective.
And I find that your perspective is extremely valuable, and I am most certain that those that have attended this call will feel the same way. So again, thank you very much. Hopefully this isn't the last time we get a chance to chat with you. Personally, I hope it's not for me, but I'd like to say thanks again, and also thank you to the Diversity Council here at Town Square. Thank you to our IT department here at Town Square, and thank you to Emily Gomez for coordinating this, getting you back on the phone or on the virtual call, and setting this whole thing up.
Emily's the bomb.
She would think so too. Well, everybody, thank you for attending today's call. I appreciate you. Appreciate the hard work that everybody's putting in there for the organization, and we'll see you soon.